everybody. I'm Bridget. I'm the director of the Master Professional Writing Program. I think I know most of the people in this room. So welcome, and welcome to Susan Orlean. We are so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you.
And we are so thrilled that Dana's in the back, and MG's here as well. So we have some MPW faculty here, and Dana, of course, brought you. Before we start, I just wanted to say that an engineer might come in at some point and turn on the air conditioning, and then we'll close the door, just so you know. We have a couple of events I just want to say really quickly. This Friday, Amy Gersler is reading at Skylight with some of our students. It's a student-faculty reading, so Erin LaRosa, Sarah Lowe, Justin McFarr, Breen Murphy, and Russell Nakamura are reading. And if those of you who are new to MPW, if you haven't been to Skylight yet, it's an amazing bookstore. So that's a must-go. And then next Wednesday, we actually have two events overlapping because one event does tread upon the other's heels. One is with MG Lord's travel writing class. She's bringing Mary Roach, who wrote Packing for Mars. And then our dueling event at the same time, we're having an agent's panel. And her agent. So those are our two events. You can check those out on Facebook. Again, many thanks to Dana. And as you know, Dana is also a staff writer at the New Yorker and is teaching a profile writing class for us here this semester. In the fall, she's teaching a young adult lit class. And she's also a poet. And in bringing Susan Orlean, it's so interesting for this class, of course, and for all the students at MPW. And I think it's Flaubert who talks about the bunny day. He says, oh, there's, if you can find the good idea. And it seems like Susan Orlean always finds the good idea. Just these fascinating meditations and explorations of genuinely interesting people. And her latest session, her interest seems to be chickens. And I've been following that with great interest because one of my other favorite writers, Flannery OConnor, loved fowl and peahens. And she also loved extraordinary and interesting characters and people with lots of idiosyncrasies. So the structure is that Dana and Susan will talk, and then Dana will open it up to questions. So again, thank you so much for being here, and let's give a warm MPW welcome to Susan Orlean.
Thank you. I have to say before we begin that I have been asked any number of times whether I have trained my chickens to walk backwards, which apparently Flannery OConnor was able to do. And I actually defy anyone to prove to me that this isn't just myth. I mean, my chickens are above average in intelligence, but I can't picture them walking backward on command.
It was before YouTube, so she could say whatever she wanted.
That's true, although apparently there is a little clip of her chicken walking backwards, if it's a real chicken. Just saying.
Well, I wanted to say a little bit about Susan, who it's just such a privilege to have you here, Susan. Thank you so much for coming. Susan is my friend and a colleague and a writer I have deeply admired for many, many years. I met Susan in 1999.
Wow.
I was an assistant at the New Yorker working for two editors, one of whom, John Bennett, had been your editor, right? And one of whom, Lee Aiken, was currently your editor.
Right. John hadn't actually ever been my editor, but Lee...
He always acted like he had.
Oh.
I think he wanted to have been.
Oh, all right. Well, I accept that. But Lee was my editor at the time.
And Susan was, at that point, the New Yorker had moved into the Condé Nast building, which was a very kind of, is a sort of gray, corporate, quiet kind of place. And Susan's office somehow was just like this brilliant explosion of color. And I always think about that with you. And when the door was closed, it literally glowed pink, and I have no idea how you did that or what was going on in there, but to me that still conjures like, oh, that's real creativity is happening in there, it's turning pink. And then when the door was open, which was most of the time, right. You could see that there was just, evidence of a life lived with such, just this intrepid life, all these cool objects from around the world and everything you had collected. And then I'll just say that I once went to, Susan invited me to a party, which was the coolest thing that any writer at the New Yorker could do for a young assistant, and you were the only writer at the New Yorker who, at that stage, who ever invited me to a party. And I went to Susan's house, and this was in Dutchess County, maybe?
Yeah, yeah.
And I had this really crummy old car that I drove there and got lost and was incredibly late. And then I got to the party, and it was the most fascinating mix of people. And I could see that Susan also, in addition to collecting objects, collected these really, really interesting people. So much so that I drove back to New York with a car full, an entire Bhutanese family in my car. I gave the lift back to, and I kept thinking, oh my God, my car is going to break down, and then what are we going to do? Well,
It's really
incredibly
funny.
sweet people and me. Susan began her career as a reporter in Portland, working first for what I've read described as an alternative monthly, and then the paper.
Yeah, it's a tiny, tiny little
tiny
magazine.
publication. And then for Willamette Week, which is a well-known alternative weekly magazine, or it's kind of a news, it's a broadsheet, right?
Right, yeah.
And then in the 80s, Susan worked in Boston and New York, started writing books and started writing for Rolling Stone and Vogue, and then was hired to write Talk of the Town stories for the New Yorker, where she became a staff writer in 1992. And I think this is a correct timeline, that within 2 years you wrote what would be the first installment of the study of the character of John LaRoche, which became The Orchid Thief, the best-selling book, and as nobody will let you forget, later the basis for a movie adaptation. And you've also written about children's beauty pageants, Caltech-trained professional origami folder, skeet shooting, the decorator Rose Tarlow, student body president of Martin Luther King Junior High School in Manhattan, and among many other subjects, a show dog named Biff.
One of my more challenging profiles, I will say.
I am going to ask you to read the lead to that profile because it's so great. I brought it. And Susan is currently working on her 8th book, which will come out in the fall, and is a biography of the dog actor Rin Tin Tin. So,
For which, by the way, I used archives here as I was driving into campus. I suddenly had that deja vu of the parking garage and realized I think the Warner Brothers archives are here. So I spent a certain amount of time. So I basically consider myself a full-time student. Just back on campus.
So because you are really appearing in my profile writing class, I'm going to start the conversation with a discussion of profiles. And I wondered, could you talk about the Talk of the Town length is about 800 words. And could you talk about going from that length and mode of writing into writing profiles, and what that transition was like for you, and maybe talk about writing short profiles too, because you've done that too?
Yeah. It's interesting because when I started Talk of the Town, for me, the very natural, easiest Talk of the Town was to find an interesting person and basically take a verbal snapshot. And often those snapshots reveal a great deal more than what they appear to reveal. I had done, actually one of the great compliments I ever got was I had done a Talk of the Town piece about Frank Stella, the artist who's been profiled left and right, and there probably have been books written about him. And I had learned that he loved squash, the game squash, not the vegetable squash. And there was a squash tournament, like the international squash competition was going on in New York. And somehow or another, and I don't remember how the idea came about, I thought maybe Frank Stella would like to go to a squash game with me. So he agreed, and we went. And so the piece was extremely circumscribed. It was about being at the squash game with Frank Stella. And yet he told me later, and he told a few other people, that he felt it was the best profile of him that he'd ever read. So my first argument is length doesn't necessarily make or break a profile. They obviously have very different functions, a short profile versus a very long one. But I think you can say something extremely perceptive and insightful about someone in a short length. It's actually challenging sometimes to grow a story from that small size to the medium size. I think medium is the hardest length to write.
Is that 3,000 to 4,000 words?
Yeah, I think that that's probably exactly what you've been told to do. So I just want to say, fight the power. Do not, no, it's just, a very short piece has as its greatest advantage that it's not pretending to be any more than it is. It's saying, here's a moment with someone, and if you have a good eye, you can learn a great deal. If you sit next to someone on an airplane and you get off and over dinner say to someone, I met the most interesting person on an airplane, and in 2 minutes describe them, that's a very vivid description. So I like to keep that in mind when I'm doing those short pieces. It's a little harder when you move into that next size where you're fleshing out that picture. There's more background. There's more, the question is begged suddenly, as it is not in a short profile. Why should I care about this? Right. Why should I care about this person? In a short piece, you don't ever have to argue that. You just say, this is interesting, give me a minute. When you get to that longer size, and particularly if you're interested in writing about people who are not famous or controversial or, you suddenly you embark in a conversation with a reader which is all about, I don't understand why I should care about this. In a much longer piece, you've got that issue, but you've got all that extra time to spin out a longer story. In the case of a lot of certainly let me start with the example of my first full-length profile for The New Yorker. It had begun as a talk piece. I had heard, and again, I don't remember how I heard about this guy. He was a guy who was a cab driver who happened to be the king of the Ashanti tribe in the United States. So I thought, this is a wonderful talk piece. And I went to meet him, and I just thought, this man is so engaging and wonderful, and the story of what his life is all about, and the whole story of the tribe and how he's king, and I just thought this is a much bigger story. I've got to do this as a longer piece. And so that turned into my first full-length piece for the magazine, and it was run under the rubric of a profile. I like profiles, though, to live in the world between profile and the non-genre writing. Part of it is because I like, when I'm profiling someone, to have them live their life in front of me as much as possible, so that a great deal of the piece is about them interacting in the world without specifically being, let me ask you questions. Where'd you grow up? What's your favorite color? But rather spending as much time with them as I can where they're not even necessarily interacting with me at all. They've just agreed to let me be present.
So you're as much profiling or reporting on their world as you are.
Definitely. Yeah. And my conversation with the reader, in a sense, then, is I'm going to show you a world you probably don't know exists, and the person who's your guide into that world is very interesting as an individual, but also as a representative of this other world, whatever that world is. Some profiles are more specifically about an individual, like the Robert Lang, the Origami Master, who... Are you guys reading Bullfighter or...
No, they
Oh,
have
okay.
read The Orchid Thief.
Okay. I had profiled...
Although they do a lot of extracurricular reading that I don't ask them to do.
May
so
I
I'm
may
sure
I
that-
recommend? No, I had heard about a guy who was a rocket scientist and basically left the Jet Propulsion Lab to become a full-time origami maker, origami master. You know, and how could you resist that as a story? I could not. I flung myself. But he was a really interesting person, and his career had taken such a weird path that the story was, in terms of percentage, and because he worked alone, the story was probably slightly more about him as an individual and slightly less about the origami world, although that proved to be this huge world.
And you gave us such a sense of it and the history of origami and Japan, and I mean,
and all of these, you know, crazy competitions that go on. And then I went to an origami club of, you know, basically little old ladies in a garage in Anaheim making
sort of the
origami.
crafting world came into play.
Yeah, and it was, but, you know, I think that they're just, all of these stories are always about a world and how far forward the individual is in the sort of stage set depends a little on them as a particular person, and also just the world they describe.
Do you find it easier when dealing with editors to emphasize the individual that will be the vehicle through the world, and then when you turn in the writing, you've actually spent much more time on the world?
Yeah, I think, for one thing, I think editors are really scared if you come to them and say, origami. You know, they go, no. You know, I think that's for men. And the fact is, to say I'm going to write a story about a subculture, that's a very challenging undertaking, not for the faint of heart. And a lot of times those stories fall apart. I mean, they're difficult. It's a far more marketable idea to say, I've met this very interesting person. He, you know, Jet Propulsion Lab scientist, gave it up to be an origami master. That an editor is much more comfortable, partly because they know you've got a narrative thread that's going to lead you, rather than just this sort of amorphous description of a subculture.
Right.
I mean, I think if I had said, I'm going to write a book just kind of about all the crazy people who collect orchids, you think, ooh, that just sounds like, I don't know, it's just too diffuse. If you lead in, also, in terms of selling a story idea, people are interested in people. So it, as simply a trick of the trade, that's a much easier, and it's easier for people to sort of begin to understand a story if you say there's a very interesting person and he can kind of show us this other world.
So can you talk about approaching subjects, and we can use LaRoche as an example?
Sure.
Since everybody sort of has a sense of him and how he might or might not have been receptive to
Well,
your
first of all,
advances.
how many of you have seen Adaptation? And I can tell you that interaction was one of the things in the movie that was, in fact, accurate. What happened with this was I really didn't know what I was getting into, and I had originally gone down to Florida just thinking crazy court case, odd scenario, would make an interesting short piece.
And before Google and aggregators and all of that, you really just read this little squib about it in a newspaper.
And even more serendipitously, I was flying, I'd been on vacation in Mexico, flying home, someone had left a copy of the Miami Herald in the seat
Right,
pocket.
which in New York you never would have been.
No, yeah. And so it was ideal. And, you know, I'm just flipping through and looking, you know, looking in the inside of the paper where the stuff that they didn't rip from AP is there, not with the intention of looking at for a story idea, but just out of curiosity. And when I saw the headline, you know, rare orchid poaching, whatever, lands local man in jail, and I thought, what? You know, read the story. I thought, this is so weird. I didn't even know orchids grew wild. I will say, I entered this quite ignorantly. No, I thought they grew at Home Depot.
Right.
So it was, you know, I tore it out, and I do this all the time. I'll see something, or a flyer, or overhear a conversation, and I just tore it out and thought, oh, this is so weird. This would kind of be a cool story. I certainly didn't have any expectation of what I would learn, and I really did think it would be about the court case. When I went down for the hearing, and LaRoche was there on the stand, you know, pontificating and announcing that he was the smartest person he knew, and I just thought, this guy is insane. And I went up to him after, you know, the hearing was over and kind of cornered him, and I said, I'm with the New Yorker, because I hadn't talked to him before I went down there.
So this is fascinating. I mean, that was a huge risk to get on a plane and fly to Florida and have had no contact with your...
None. And,
hope for something.
And it really is something that it's a little unnerving. I mean, it's lucky in the case of having a magazine behind you that says, sure, it sounds interesting, go ahead. But I didn't know how to reach him, and the hearing was coming up very quickly. So I basically got home, repacked, and left, and went down to Florida. I actually initially thought that I'd be focusing more on the Seminoles who were involved. But he was this sort of larger-than-life, crazy character. And I just kind of buttonholed him. But also, I really went down without an idea of what I was getting into, which if there's any reporting trick that I have, which is no trick at all, and that is, don't learn in advance. Learn by learning. I mean, to me, the writing process for me is a learning experience, and then reversing it and trying to teach people what I've learned. And those words sound very sort of flat and dull, but it's basically me going out into the world unprepared as possible so that I'm as open as I can be, and let the story make itself appear to me rather than saying, before I know anything, this is what the story will be. Let it unfold and follow it rather than decide where it's going.
I think you can feel that curiosity still alive in your pieces, which is one of the things that distinguishes your work and makes it, it's not information. There's so much information in your stories always, but that's not the reading experience. You feel your enthusiasm and the sort of crackling of your interest in it as you read. So.
And I think because that's really authentic.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I come back from an experience and I'm really excited, and I think, oh my, I've got to tell you about, I just went to Florida and I met this crazy guy, and did you know there's this huge world of insane orchid collectors? And the book was really just a document in a sense. I mean, obviously there's all the blood and tears of writing it, but ideally it feels like that. It feels like me saying, I just learned the most interesting thing.
So when you sit down to, I'm just going off on a tangent for a second
That's
because
good.
I need to know what it's like. Do you sit down to write? You feel that kind of you're in that mood of kind of little frothy mood of sort of
Yeah.
almost like you're telling a friend of what you saw and experienced?
And that's my model, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like my model is as much an oral tradition as a written one. I feel like I'd like to think that the books feel told to you, and that the tone is somebody saying, "I'm so excited, you're never going to believe this." I talk out my stories a lot, and it's something that I really encourage my students to do, which is, you know, even though in an academic setting, a lot of what you're doing is homework, you've got to find in it the thing that can really ignite your excitement. And for me, learning is always, even if it's about something I don't like or I actually don't understand, you know, it's always about learning and going, oh my God, who knew? And then just because this is exactly the way I live my life, which is that I'm always saying to people, oh, you're not going to believe this. Did you know that orchids existed before dinosaurs? And so it's not that I'm presenting myself as an expert. I'm saying to you, I've had this opportunity, because this is what I do for a living, to learn this incredible thing. And I'm so excited to tell you about it. So talking it out and hearing how I describe it to people in the most unself-conscious way helps me begin hearing what in the story, not with notes in front of me, no outline, nothing, just talking about it from knowing it and from feeling excited about it.
And those are the best part. Those are
Yeah.
that's like the
Yeah.
Pope's nose there.
Yeah. And that's where I've often thought, if you could sit in front, that you could ideally do your story as a performance in a sense, and then it's just what happens. What makes the writing hard is between hearing the way you would say it and putting it on paper, people tend to get uptight and start thinking, do I first explain origami, or do I introduce Robert Lang, or how can I introduce Robert Lang without telling you what origami is? But if I tell you about origami, who cares? And yet we all converse with each other this way all the time. So what you try to do is find that more natural way of sharing a story.
Okay, so let's talk about leads. You write such amazing leads, and I'm going to make you lead.
I will say the show dog lead
Yeah, you have to read it.
was one that
It's
when I
awesome.
wrote it, I thought this was a very special opportunity. I knew I would never again have this chance. And it's very immature, but bear with me. All right, so here's it's an extraordinary photograph. Was that an Avedon
It looks
portrait, I
like
think,
it, yeah.
of this dog? So the piece is called Show Dog. If I were a bitch, I'd be in love with Biff Truesdale. Biff is perfect. He's friendly, good-looking, rich, famous, and in excellent physical condition. He almost never drools. He's not afraid of commitment. He wants children. Actually, he already has children and wants a lot more. He works hard and is a consummate professional, but he also knows how to have fun. What Biff likes most is food and sex. This makes him sound boorish, which he is not. He's just elemental. Food he likes even better than sex. His favorite things to eat are cookies, mints, and hotel soap, but he will eat just about anything. Richard Krieger, a friend of Biff's who occasionally drives him to appointments, said not long ago, when we're driving on I-95, we'll usually pull over at McDonald's. Even if Biff is napping, he always wakes up when we're getting close. I get him a few plain burgers with buns, no ketchup, no mustard, and no pickles. He loves hamburgers. I don't get him his own French fries, but if I get myself fries, I always flip a few for him into the back seat.
So good. That also showcases your abilities with well, I was going to say physical description, although when I think about it, there's not actual physical description in that. But again, somehow I don't need it after that lead, you know. But physical description is something that you do amazingly well, also. And
so much fun.
You have
actually.
You have to read the first paragraph of the Orchid Thief too.
Oh, okay. Should I do that now?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It's because I'll never. I mean, I think of the al dente spaghetti like twice a week. It's amazing.
And
This
is funny. I just want to say, when I first started working on the book, after I had written the original piece for the magazine, I had thought that I would begin with a description of the Fakahatchee. And I was really struggling. And then my editor at the time said to me, you know, I said, I don't know, should I begin with the place? Should I begin with flowers? Should I begin with La Roche? And he said to me, you know, people are interested in people. We're more interested, you're more willing to read a little bit about an intriguing person and keep going than you are to read about something, even a description of a place. So it made me appreciate that as a given, that it's what, you know, your first challenge in any piece of writing is to get people to keep reading. Mm-hmm. So the lead is that important in that regard, and we're all secretly very curious to know a little bit about somebody. So that's why I was really glad I decided to go with this. John LaRoche is a tall guy, skinny as a stick, pale-eyed, slouch-shouldered, and sharply handsome, in spite of the fact that he is missing all his front teeth. He has the posture of al dente spaghetti and the nervous intensity of someone who plays a lot of video games. LaRoche is 36 years old. Until recently, he was employed by the Seminole tribe of Florida, setting up a plant nursery and an orchid propagation laboratory on the tribe's reservation in Hollywood, Florida. LaRoche strikes many people as eccentric. The Seminoles, for instance, have two nicknames for him, Troublemaker and Crazy White Man. Once, when LaRoche was telling me about his childhood, he remarked, "Boy, I sure was a weird little kid." For as long as he can remember, he's been exceptionally passionate and driven. When he was about 9 or 10, his parents said he could pick out a pet. He decided to get a little turtle. Then he asked for 10 more little turtles. Then he decided he wanted to breed the turtles. And then he started selling turtles to other kids. And then he could think of nothing but turtles, and then decided that his life wasn't worth living unless he could collect one of every single turtle species known to mankind, including one of those sofa-sized tortoises from the Galapagos.
That's so good.
About physical description,
yeah.
I just want to throw this in. It was funny. I had I teach at NYU, and I told my students that I never wanted them to tell me someone's age unless it actually was relevant, because I found that all of their descriptions were, you know, a woman in her mid-20s walked into a room, and I think, what do I care that she's in, I mean, it's not a survey. I don't need to know that. And then I said to them, most people in the world have brown hair. You can forego telling me that someone has brown hair unless you can say something interesting about it. I'm a believer in description being lean and mean. You don't need to detail every single thing about the way a person looks. It's so much more valuable to leave an impression that's extremely vivid. Or, you know, I mean, to me it was a gift that LaRoche was missing all his teeth, because it came as such a slam at the end of the sentence and set you off thinking this guy is contradictory. And describing him, I mean, through the course of the book, I end up filling in more details about his appearance, but I felt like I hope with that little description you have it in your mind, what he's like. Not every detail of everything about the way he looks, but just how he strikes you.
Because you're trying to get at character through physical description.
Right,
so
right.
The details you choose are pointing the reader somewhere.
Right, and saying he has medium-length brown hair, and you think, okay, wow, that really means a lot. And
right.
Now my students have gone to the other extreme and refused to say that anyone has hair or will not mention an age. And someone recently wrote a profile for the class describing their sibling, who I thought was in her late teens or early 20s, and then there's some mention about a diaper, and I said, you know what? There are times where saying an age actually is relevant. I didn't mean never. I just meant if it doesn't, it was really weird to read a whole piece and then think, wait, I've got to read this again. This is a toddler. Yeah, really. It's just a matter of making every detail matter.
Right.
Or, you can leave a lot out if it's not interesting. People fill in all of that.
Mm-hmm. And how do you turn a profile, even a profile that is secretly a piece about a world, into a book?
This, when I finished writing the piece for the magazine, I just felt like there was so much more that I wanted to learn about every element of the story. So I don't think it's enough just to have a story continue in a linear way. I think it has to be that you're going to expand it kind of in every direction. I wanted to learn more about Florida. I wanted to learn about the history of the Fakahatchee, about the history of orchid collecting, about LaRoche and what was going to happen, ultimately with the trial, with the Seminole tribe and what they were going to, so it felt like it needed to radiate in every direction to sustain a book. I didn't think just saying I'm going to write about orchid collecting would have interested me enough. I mean, there have been books about orchid collecting, but I just didn't feel that was enough for me. Mm-hmm. But I also began picturing the book as this journey through these worlds that had quite unexpectedly collided, mm-hmm. Of this crazy guy, of the Seminoles, of the orchid world, that you wouldn't ordinarily ever expect these things to have any intersecting point. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of following them back out from the intersecting point. And LaRoche then became my guide through, and that I also felt I had to structure it so that no matter how far off the subject I went, that I could always bring you back to LaRoche.
And you could bring us back just by ending the section and starting him with some fascinating new LaRoche thing.
Right, and that I could keep, it was not an easy book to write, no. And it wasn't, the structure was thematic rather than following a timeline particularly. But I felt like you could follow me as also that I was a character, that less explicitly described, but it seems to me that it's very liberating to look at every piece as that you're present in every piece, whether there's first person or not, mm-hmm. and that you're taking the reader on a journey, and that they always feel your hand on their back, mm-hmm. Kind of taking them in and out of these worlds. And that's how it felt that it could grow into a book. Mm-hmm. In terms of practical, just the practical part of it, I went back down to Florida many times. For several weeks at a time, and kind of followed each thread and tried to spend as much time with LaRoche as I could, just sort of absorbing more of his uniqueness. And also, I think, like a lot of books, there usually is one arc that has to kind of get completed. I mean, there was this issue of, was I ever going to see this ghost orchid, and was it really worth all of this, heartache, and was it in itself worthwhile? And of course, as you know, I never did. And then I had to cope with, okay, the book didn't turn out the way I thought. And then I thought, but it is the way it turned out. This is reality, and that in the long run, it actually made sense to me as this journey that was really about the journey, and it really never was, for LaRoche nor for me, ever going to be about some concrete accomplishment.
Because it's a book about curiosity that deepens to the point of mania, basically.
And it can never be fulfilled.
Right.
I mean, that's the whole point. It's about that persistence of desire and curiosity, and how it really, it's self-perpetuating, and that's as it's sort of meant to be.
And so in that way, it also is a story about you.
Yeah,
whether
very
you
much.
were a character in it or not.
Yeah, and I think that there was a moment where, and I think the film really pointed this out even more than I did in the book, which was, I thought, well, I'm really no different from LaRoche, even though I'm looking at him and thinking, he's so weird, and how could you do this, and how could you spend your entire life learning about this one thing and then just walk away? And I thought, well, yeah, I guess that's sort of what I do for a living, and, learning intensely about taxidermy, and then when I'm done, I move on, and then I'm learning about show dogs, and it was, and there's never an end point. You've never learned everything. Right. You never will. There's just an arbitrary point where you say, I'm moving on. So had I seen a ghost orchid, first of all, I don't think they're probably all that great. I mean, it's not like I would have said, oh, now I get it. Now, yeah. I mean, I don't think it would have answered the question of why do people pursue things so avidly. I think it would have been, well, it doesn't matter.
Right.
They pursue things because
that's
the way, that's the way we're wired. That's just the way people are. So it didn't, even though I thought, Christ, I'm going to kill myself. I thought, no, it's as it should be. And of course, that's why the movie, among other things, why I loved that they sort of played on the whole idea of, is this the most amazing thing if you finally achieve what you think you want to achieve, or is it disappointing? What's the final outcome of achievement, so to speak?
Well, I think that as you were saying, this could have been, this is a little niche, this is a weird little world, this is a subculture, and somehow this book, in your telling of the story of this culture, you were able to connect with so many people who don't care about flowers, so many people who don't care about Florida, so many people who don't care about the Seminole Indians or John LaRoche or explorers or any of the things, the myriad things you talk about in this book, because it is about that hunger, and I think because the dormant feeling that it's about you, and the hunger of a mind to know things.
Yeah,
that's what makes it relate to everybody, I think.
Well, certainly, when I first started working on the book, and I always feel this whenever I'm working on something, I think, well, I'm not an orchid person. I'm not a origami person. I'm not a I'm about, I think I bring to it the same thing that I am my reader, which is, no, I'm not really interested in orchids, because I'm not, and yet, oh my God, they're so interesting. but it doesn't presume that you have to care about them as much as, but that's where I think the writer's excitement about the material is what draws you in. And the number of people who said to me, oh my God, I can't believe I read a whole book about orchids. And I said, well, I can't believe I wrote a whole book about orchids. Same thing, which is I certainly never set out to write, it's not that, it's that I followed this one little thread, and 2 or 3 or how many years it took me later, I thought, oh my God, I've learned all about this crazy thing. But it was never about, gee, I'm curious about orchids. It was really following a trail and people and passion more than, and luckily orchids are amazingly interesting.
Yeah.
But that was never what drove me into the book.
Can we talk about your current book
Sure.
project?
Yeah.
And so how did you come, obviously you have experience writing about dogs.
Right.
And other animals.
I know. It's sort of turning into a little, sub-theme of my work.
But you found, you
Excuse me.
You give internal lives to these animals that you make them as interesting as people, which is
Well, and Rin Tin Tin was actually more interesting than many people.
So how did you? Tell how you came on that subject.
Well, this I think I have to come up with a more colorful story for interviews. I'll tell you the true one, and then I have to work on a more colorful story. I was doing a piece for the magazine about the American Humane Film Unit, and those are the people who issue the No Animal Was Harmed certification for films. So I was learning a lot about animals in Hollywood, which has this very, very interesting history. And the name Rin Tin Tin popped up, and it was that funny feeling of going, oh, God, that's a name that I haven't thought of in a million years. And just idly, I Googled Rin Tin Tin, and my idea was that Rin Tin Tin was a TV show in the 50s that, started playing when I was basically the year I was born, and so my memory of it was sort of fuzzy, that it ran in reruns for many years. But that was all I knew. And I Googled Rin Tin Tin, and I literally almost fell off my chair to discover that he was a real dog who was born in World War I on a battlefield in France and had made close to 30 silent films, that he had a real life. It was like finding out that Santa Claus actually lived and was born. I just thought, what? It was so, or Superman. To find out there really was a Superman. I thought there really was a Rin Tin Tin, and it was such a sort of surreal feeling of sort of turning inside out something that I assumed I knew. And when I began following that thread, I just found myself drawn into this incredible story of almost 100 years of American history. And obviously, a lot of people say to me, the same dog is still alive? It was born in 1918? I think, okay, that would make a great book. But no, it's not the same dog. But it really was like falling down this crazy rabbit hole of something that had seemed very small, this television character, and falling down into 1918, World War I, a young Californian who was in the U.S. Army who found a puppy who was absolutely, most certainly, he found a bombed-out German war dog kennel, and all the dogs in it were dead except for one mother dog who had just given birth to a litter of puppies. And he collected them out of this bombed kennel and kept two of the puppies for himself. And when the war ended, he brought them back to California. It turned into a story of Hollywood, which, learning the early history of Hollywood, if you've had any connection to Hollywood or even just like movies, is so interesting. And this was the early, early days where people dressed in cowboy costumes and hung out on just north of Hollywood Boulevard, waiting to see if they would get used in a film that day. And you know, this guy, Lee Duncan, literally went door to door with the dog saying, my dog is super smart, can I have a part in a movie? But Hollywood was absolutely handmade at the time. It was really a different universe. Then to realize that those silent films were shown all over the world, that Rin Tin Tin was one of the first American global stars, which blew my mind and also answered a persistent question of my childhood, which, you know, suddenly I put two and two together about why my grandfather, who had been born in Europe, had this Rin Tin Tin figurine. Mm-hmm. So it turned into a very curious, it was just an incredible learning experience. And the Nazis and their obsession with German Shepherds and Hitler's obsession with German Shepherds and the American relationship to dogs, which has been a tremendously evolving, you know, in 1920, people had dogs, but dogs lived outside. So the movement of dogs from outside into homes and to become family members was this tremendous cultural change, and it also reflected people moving off farms into cities. And of course there's a great deal of philosophy and sociology about what animals mean to us and why we relate to animals the way that we do. In the 1920s, there were 80 German Shepherds starring in films. In World War II, tens of thousands of Americans donated their pet dogs to the U.S. Army to serve in the war. So this was like one of these things where every day I was probably so annoying to live with. I'd come home and say to my husband, you're not going to believe this, because everything was just blowing my mind. And it turned into this extraordinary a way of looking at history in all of these rather oblique ways, but also through these three main characters: the guy who found the dog in the war, Lee Duncan; the producer of the television show, who was the classic riches to rags Hollywood story, ended up dying literally homeless and penniless after having been the biggest deal in Hollywood; and the woman who has anointed herself basically the keeper of the flame.
Is she still alive?
Yeah, she's still alive. With luck, she won't be by the time the book comes out, because
or it will kill her.
No, I didn't say that, did I? No. No, she's very litigious, and so I'm slightly afraid of her. But yeah, she's still alive.
So is she the only character, the only person you could interview who knew the...
Well, she's the only of the three main characters. She's the only one who's alive. Lee Duncan died in 1960. Burt Leonard died about 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. He's the producer.
Before you started working on the book?
Well, unfortunately, he was alive. I couldn't find him because he was, you know, and no one knew how to reach him. And then, but Daphne, the woman in Texas who has the Rin Tin Tin dogs now and most of the copyrights, I spent a lot of time with her. Mm-hmm. So the book is, of course, about the dog, but not surprisingly about these three primary characters, but it's also very much a kind of version of American history, I guess. I'm not, hard to sort of characterize it, but it's really about popular history as you can trace it through, you know, it was a an interesting oblique way to kind of learn about the way people felt about World War II, that there was such a popular support for it, that people were doing this thing that, frankly, I would find unimaginable, which was to take my pet dog and donate it to the army.
How they felt about World War II and how they then felt about dogs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how, you know, it just is, in a way, looking at those margins sometimes tells you volumes. So it was a great experience, although, boy, was it a lot of work.
So how did you approach the research?
Well, I am not a historian, and I felt in the beginning all thumbs. I didn't know how you could write a book that relied on historical material. I was so used to spending, you know, real time with people I was writing about. But I'd also never spent a lot of time in archives, and I didn't realize that it's like the best sort of eavesdropping. It's not that I would say from now on I only want to do books this way, but it was, in the case of Burt Leonard, for instance, he had just died. I was absolutely beside myself that I had missed this chance to talk to him, and really felt I didn't know how I was going to include him in the book. I was talking to his daughter, and she said to me completely sort of offhandedly, "Oh, you know, I think my dad had his storage unit. We haven't had time to go through it, but if you want, here's the key." So I went over. It was this place off Los Feliz, and I went over there thinking, I have no idea what's in here. It could be, you know, just some trash. Could be, who knows? Who knows? And I opened it, pulled it open, and it is stacked to the roof. Literally, I couldn't get in, with files and files and files of everything that mattered to him. Stuff he would never have shared with me if he were alive. His tax return, his divorce papers, his, you know, all of these confidential documents that were part of a million lawsuits he was involved in. Memos. He had throat cancer and he had lost his voice, so in the last couple years of his life, everything was written notes, and they were all in there. So I felt like it's still my nature to feel that the way I know how to write is to be with people and observe them, but I realized that it was a way of being with him that...
More intimate.
Yeah, and more... you're the classic fly on the wall. I mean, he had no... I mean, I felt like he was really present. I mean, I have no idea what is going to happen in the future with this kind of research when most of what we do is electronic and there's no record of it. But this was remarkable also because no one had gone through this stuff. There were things in there that would never go into an archive because they were too personal. You know, I mean, stuff, it was ideal. Lee Duncan's archives are in Riverside, and he was a carbon copier. So he had carbon copies of all his letters. He kept lots of stuff. And, you know, there were his daughters alive, his granddaughters alive. But still, what happened was realizing that people could emerge in a very real way. I guess it's like reading a book. It's just that it's a different... It's a really different way of learning about someone. But there were days when I was in Riverside going through Lee Duncan's material where I was just completely absorbed, and when I finally got to the point where it was obvious he had died, I was totally depressed. I mean, I knew he had died, but I'm reading all this material. I started seeing notes saying, you know, hope you're feeling better. And then I came to a letter that his wife had written to the American Kennel Club asking to have the ownership of the dogs transferred to her name because he had just died. And I had to close the box and leave. I thought, it felt like he had just died in front of me. I mean, even though I'm not a historian, and I'm sure a person with more training could have found databases and things that I didn't know, but that opportunity to look at that material, I've now developed a tremendous appreciation for how much life there is in it, and how people can do this historical research and create profiles from that kind of material.
And the reporting lesson that I want you guys to take from this is that, what was the producer's name again? I'm sorry.
Burt Leonard.
Burt Leonard. You found his daughter.
Yeah.
And you did that with your feet in person when
Yeah.
you found her.
Yeah.
And formed a relationship with her. And that's why she gave you the key to the storage unit.
Absolutely. And actually, in the case of Lee, it was not easy finding his daughter and his granddaughter, and that was really valuable.
Yeah.
And also, they led me to where the material was. I mean, there's just a lot of shoe leather that you need. And, there are times where you just feel, it's like being a Fuller brush salesman or something. You're just knocking on a lot of doors and trying to find people, and there are times when it feels very unrewarding or awkward, but making those, I couldn't have done the book without finding those people, because they really did anchor me in the present. Certainly a lot of biographies are written strictly out of historical material, but historians do that. This was really important for me to have that connection. And yeah, it's just lots of phone calls and lots of, set up Google alerts. I mean, that's how I found his daughter, actually, because I had Google alerts set, I had Google alerts set up for everybody involved in the book. And, it was just a pure, it's free, what's funny is I also had a Google alert for Rin Tin Tin, which means something in Indonesian, apparently, because I got every Indonesian blog. Also, there's that annoying song that Blues Traveler did. I don't care if you're Anne Boleyn or Rin Tin Tin. You know that song. Everybody knows this song. It must be on the web every day. I mean, and now when I hear the song, I think it's invading my brain. Anyway, that's, it's the easiest thing in the world to do with a subject. It was what led me to Bert's daughter, because the obituary popped up, it listed his, survivors, and through, not so much effort, I was able to finally find her, because she lives in LA. There's just a certain amount of detective work with that when you, and some of it doesn't work out. I really wanted to find the ad agency that handled the Rin Tin Tin television show in the 50s. And unfortunately, ad agencies merge and split a million times. So this agency doesn't exist, and it gotten absorbed into Saatchi & Saatchi or some other huge agency. And I could never find someone there who could find, and my guess is they probably don't necessarily keep material from the 1950s, but you run into dead ends, but they're all worth trying. At least, make the phone calls and search, and the internet has made searching a lot easier, but there's still real life knocking on doors. Don't do everything online.
Yeah.
There's just a lot that's still not there, and not, phone numbers, finding people, not all available online.
Right. I think I have to let you guys ask some questions, because I've gotten to ask so many questions. Does anyone want to get us going?
Sure, I have a question about working for the New Yorker, actually. Do you get to pick the stories that you write, or do you get assigned them, or is it a mixture of the two?
Well, knock on wood, the New Yorker, unlike most magazines, is really driven almost entirely by the interests of the writers. I mean, there are times when someone will say, I have a good idea you might like, but in fact, a good part of your value to the magazine really is bringing ideas. So I consider that a huge part of what I always have to do, which is to be thinking of interesting ideas, and not just interesting ideas, but ideas that would actually coalesce into a story, which is a whole other piece of that.
So for going back to interviewing you, are all your subjects, or like when you found his daughters, were they willing to talk to you? I mean, or when you run into someone who is maybe not so willing to talk to you, or is a little wary of you if you say, I'm going to be writing a profile or I'm writing a book, I mean, how do you kind of come around and establish that relationship with them so that they're willing to share these things with you?
There are people who simply will not talk to you. I find that to be less frequent than you'd think. But I think people want to tell their stories. They don't necessarily trust that you're going to do that. I found it, first of all, there's something that's just purely true, that if people believe that you're really there to hear them out, they instinctively know it, they're more inclined to that. Secondly, even though it sometimes frightens people when I say to them, I can spend as much time as you're willing to give me, it's very different from saying, I'd like to, sit down, half hour, bang, talk to you. And that makes people, it even makes me apprehensive, where you think, I don't want to misspeak, I think suggesting that you're there to learn as much as you can is a great benefit. I don't usually take no for an answer, and sometimes what I've done is I start reporting around the person. They're not willing, so, and they don't always end up agreeing. I mean, I was trying to profile this woman in New Jersey who had 27 pet tigers, and she was really insane. She was really crazy, and I kept saying to her, I want to hear your side of this, because of course she was being demonized. And I really did want to hear her side of it. I didn't think I would agree with her, but I wanted to hear it. But she absolutely refused. And I ended up being persuaded by my editor to do the story anyway, and to do it to fill in as much as I could around her. And there are times when that's the way you go about it. Quite often, if you're doing that, people in the last moment will say, well, I want to talk now, because, and these aren't stories that are meant to be contrarian or argumentative, and, but people sometimes just don't want to talk to a writer. And in this case, I thought I went for trial every stupid day it was a really long drive. It was near Trenton. And every day I'd be driving down there, and I think, oh my God, she sure better talk to me. And she never talked to me. I mean, I think she came close, and then she just didn't. But I was able to do the story around her anyway, and I talked to so many people, and I made it very clear in the story that I was unable to talk to her, that I wasn't pretending that I was able to have something that I couldn't have. But I think I think most people can sense a genuine interest and respond to it. I will say, and I say this to my students, when you say to someone, can I take up some of your time, it's for a school assignment, it's totally different from saying, you're going to be published in a newspaper or magazine. People, you're asking for time, and a lot of people just think, look, I don't have time for your school assignment. it's a little different if you're saying, this is for the New York Times, or this is for whatever. It's going to be published. There's a little vanity that comes into play where they think, oh, or even just, well, I want to make sure that I get to speak my piece. So don't be discouraged. I just think that the experience you'll have in the real world working is not the same as the experience. I mean, I have to confess, when people contact me and say, I need to profile a writer for my school assignment, I always say no, because I think, look, I'm sorry, I don't want to do it anyway, but if it's, I mean, I have to admit, you just think, well, I wish people would stop giving that assignment. Because I think it's really hard for people to say, look, I don't have enough time in my life anyway, and I know it's for your school assignment, but it just somehow, I mean, that's just the truth. So don't be discouraged if you find people less available. It will be different when you're doing it for publication.
There was an article recently in Slate about how few women writers actually appear in magazines. I was wondering, as a woman, as a female writer reporter, how that has helped you and how it's hurt you.
I think it's a neutral. And as I said to Slate, because I talked, or whatever, some other Jezebel, whoever the response was, I have not experienced any institutional position on women writers are good or bad. Never. And I've never encountered that at all. I happen to think, at the risk of being, speaking completely frankly, it's a very hard life for a woman with a family. I have a kid, I have a husband. This kind of reporting, this kind of devotion to a project, correct me if I'm wrong, it just is not an easy, I think there aren't that many women doing long nonfiction writing because it's not a very easy way to live. And if you have a kid, to be away for long stretches, which many of these stories require, I don't think men are evil. I just have noticed that my husband goes away for work and he doesn't seem to find it the conflict that I do. So that's, the New Yorker has a very female-heavy editorial staff. The executive editor, the deputy editor, at least 3 or 4, the fiction editor, many of the senior editors are women. Yeah. So it is not a magazine where women are not represented, but I think it's not a total accident that there are a lot of powerful women in jobs that don't require some of what it requires. Doing this book was really tough. It took me as long as it took because my son was born 6 years ago, and I couldn't figure out how to do the reporting that I was used to doing with a baby.
Susan, you have to stop talking about this. You're scaring me.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's really true, though.
And there are women who do extraordinary stuff. Jane Mayer.
Yeah.
There are a lot of, but I really don't see, and it's certainly not the New Yorker. And I don't write for lots of other magazines now, so I can't speak to them. But I never encountered it as an institutional attitude of let's make sure there aren't too many women writing, nor has it helped me, I guess, every now and again, if someone thinks, we better have a woman, maybe, I don't know.
Ever since that piece came out, I've been pitching female profile subjects, and I'm getting so many more yeses. So I think it can work as an opportunity occasionally when there's sort of a sense of, oh my gosh, we have to
Yeah.
straighten this out?
Well, and I know the New Yorker has at times, wrung its hands and said we've got to get more women writers, not so much women subjects. But they've had some. I don't think that they're turning away women writers by any means. I think that there's a real consciousness and a desire, but it is not. It's not easy, honestly. I think you had a question too.
I did. There was a comment. There was a line at the beginning of the book about kind of how your lifestyle was totally different from LaRoche's. How he's late nights, slept all day. How do you involve yourself with someone that heavily for that long with that kind of conflict? I know that's kind of an impossible question, but.
You mean, how do you sort of tolerate spending that much time with someone?
I know you spent a ridiculous amount of time with them.
I did, and there were times where I thought, I am so gonna kill him. I have this sort of peculiar enjoyment of every now and again having that out-of-body experience of thinking, oh my God, this is my job. Like I'm riding along at 100 miles an hour with this crazy person. This is my job. And it sort of almost amuses me when I think I could be a lawyer in a law firm. It just seems so hilarious to me. I've never written about, LaRoche, in his own weird way, I found him so maddening, but also he's a good guy, and he was totally accommodating. He was really easy. He stood me up, and he was always a pain in the neck, but he couldn't have been easier as far as never saying, I want to read this before you publish it, nothing. So he was very easy to deal with. I think I'm amused by the people who I find maddening, and I've never written, I can't think of anyone I've written about who I disliked in a way that made it hard for me to be around them. Partly I'm humbled by the idea that they're willing to let me spend time with them. So even people who are sort of weird and I would never know them in my normal life and I wouldn't choose them as friends, part of me always thinks, boy, I'm so lucky that they're so game and they're willing. It's a little bit like not being in your own head when you're doing that kind of reporting, but more appreciating. Like with LaRoche, I'm sure a lot of the time I just thought, wow, he is a great subject. That would I want him as my best friend? I would probably shoot myself. But he was a great subject. So you kind of step outside what your normal likes and dislikes are. Yeah.
To extend from what you just said, so is that something that you would recommend us to do when we're searching for a subject? To look for people that fascinate us, but would not necessarily be someone that
Absolutely. I think it's really hard to write about people who are like you. Now, this is partly the path I've chosen. I like being driven by the curiosity of, in a million years, I wouldn't have known this person, or in a million years, I wouldn't be in the South Bronx at 4 a.m. at an Ashanti party. I'm driven by that. I'm not so comfortable writing about someone who I might actually know. And I think part of it is knowing my own weaknesses, that if it's someone too much like me, I'm going to want them to like me. I'm going to, start sort of relating to them without that repertorial, it's not distance actually, it's sort of the freedom that you have of feeling like we are in different worlds and we're going to come together for this time and then go back to our worlds. It's very liberating. I've come to really like many of the people I've written about, but they're not part of my life. They're not friends. And I just think I feel more free to write and to look at people with that perspective. If they're really, I actually like writing about things I don't like. when I worked for Rolling Stone, I hated writing about bands I liked. First of all, I didn't want to know all the stuff that I learned. And I also was more interested in writing about bands where I thought, how could anyone like this? You know, and it's weird maybe, but I thought, you know, I want to travel with Bon Jovi and figure out why are people throwing underpants at them. I mean, and it was just a much more compelling relationship to the subject, which is, explain this to me. I don't understand it. How could this mean so much to so many people? So that is my stance, and that comes really naturally to me, so it's not a put on. But I think that you find where you sort of find your persona, I guess, as a reporter, and find the stories that work naturally with that. And I would say, as an exercise, try writing about something you don't understand, but you've got a little curiosity about, because you may find that it is freeing in a way to not bring any of your familiar stuff to it.
I'm wondering about the living litigious person and how you protect yourself against her after the Janet Malcolm experience. Do you record interviews or keep especially detailed notes?
I'm really genuinely nervous, in fact, because she really is somebody who at any time has...
Did the team flag the manuscript?
Well, they were... Yeah, actually I was supposed to have my debriefing with the lawyer today because, you know, they obviously are going to read it for their own protection. I took good notes. I'm not the world's best note taker. I take notes by hand. I don't tape. I think that her sensitivity won't be about how I describe her, but about my suggestion that there were breaks in the lineage, that not every Rin Tin Tin was actually a direct descendant, which she might perceive as an insult, even though it means nothing to anyone. I wish I were a better note taker, but I usually go to spend so much time with people that extensive note taking isn't even practical. I mean, I went down to Texas at least 4 times to hang out with her, and I would hang out for hours. So taping never was an option. It just wouldn't have made sense. And really, I find it distracting. I'd rather be in the moment, take notes as I see them being called for. I also got lucky because she, like everybody in this book, wrote a memoir, which will never be published, but she gave it to me. So I have, in her own words, a certain amount of her personal history.
Well, the lawyer's going to love that.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm nervous only because she literally, I'm not kidding, she sues everybody. And so I'm nervous. What I've done is I keep thinking that the book, if it gets any attention, will increase the value of her dogs exponentially, and that perhaps she can then overlook whatever insults she may feel that the book doles out. But I knew going into it that she was... I mean, there were certain things I didn't get into about her that were extremely... I had material, but I felt that it was so potentially legally complicated that and somewhat tangential that I didn't include it, because it just, there are limits and you just have to be careful. And she's a private citizen.
Invasion of privacy issues, or do they?
Well, there is, no, animals don't, but there is a, Rin Tin Tin has sort of morphed into also a property. But I had some material about Daphne that was really unsavory, and my husband kept saying, aren't you going to include that? And I said, yeah, and then you can visit me in prison for the rest of my life. I'm fairly conscious of what, I mean, she is a private person, and the standard of libel for a private person is quite different from a public person, and you have to be, you know, you have to be very careful, and you don't have the legal right to say things about a private person, even if it's true. So,
Invasion of privacy.
right, exactly. So you have to be wise. Let me get your question?
Yeah. When approaching a subject, I often find myself asking the question, what's in it for them? So, I guess what I want to know is when you pick your subjects and when you approach them, what is the instinct that you try and appeal to? Their vanity, their need to listen, for someone to listen to the story, instead of storytelling. What is it?
Those two things exactly. I think people have an enormous appetite for being heard. Once they feel some amount of trust, people love telling their stories and love being listened to. And the vanity part of it is helpful if, you're asking them to give you time to tell you their story in exchange for what? I mean, if they're not a musician or an actor who's flogging a product, there's nothing in it for them except the possible enjoyment of seeing themselves in print, and that
It only works if they've never seen themselves.
right, and then they never want it again. So you kind of go find those people who've never been written about. No, I mean, I think that in many cases, they don't even know why I'm interested in their story. I mean, because I often like writing about things that there's no story. I'm just interested in the subculture. So then they become, I think, excited about the idea that they know something and they're going to teach it to me. And people love that. And that's why I like going into a lot of reporting situations as uninformed as I can possibly be, so that I can say to them, I don't know anything about this, teach me. And everybody likes to feel that they know something. One of the most sensitive stories I did about the children's beauty pageants, I knew that the woman who I was spending the most time with, like everybody in that world, felt very defensive and beleaguered. There was so much negative attention after the JonBenet Ramsey murder, and the reaction of these things are disgusting. How can people put their children on display? I went down there, and I think I managed to just sort of say, I don't even know. I mean, people are reacting to this. They don't know what this pageant world is all about. I don't know what it's about. So how does it work? And, this is her whole life. And she began saying to me, well, we have the little girls at this level and the costumes and this pageant, that pageant. And, it's her life. And I think that because I said to her, and I meant it, I want to know from your perspective what this is about. And I think she trusted me. And, and that was for her a chance to teach me and to have me learn it, not via the stories that obviously were coming out at the time. I mean, it required me being honest and saying to myself, look, I've got to really sort of drop my expectations and my natural reaction, which is, oh my, how could you do this? To think, okay, I want to learn about it, and I want to learn why you do it, because obviously there are perfectly nice people who feel that it means something to them. So that was important for me to say, I want to know why you enjoy doing this.
Yep. This is the last question, I think.
I actually have 2 questions.
These are the last 2 questions.
Well, I really enjoyed this book, particularly because of the voice. I think a lot of sort of log form journalism, there's a very Didion-esque voice of remove and chilliness, and there's so much warmth and passion in this work. And I was just wondering who you were reading at the time and what your literary influences have been over the course of your career. And then I wanted wanted to know how John LaRoche reacted to the film, and if he contacted you at all, and how.
Well, I'll start with the, I'll just start with the first question. And I mean, I love Joan Didion, and obviously, you know, in your mind, you're always imitating your heroes, but we're very different, obviously, both as people, and I suspect our voices sort of come out that way. While I was writing, I kept a couple of books on my desk, and I can't tell you the number of times I would turn to them at a bad moment and kind of leaf through them and see how the writers I admire solved the kinds of problems that I was running up against. One of them was John McPhee's book, Giving Good Weight, which is a collection. Another collection, the Literary Journalism, which had his piece, Travels in Georgia, which is a really phenomenal piece. In Fraser's book, Great Plains. I did keep a Joan Didion book on my desk, but yeah, I mean, and I literally kept them on the desk. Well, actually, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, where she had an essay about being in an orchid. Is that the one? That has her essay about being in a greenhouse. And actually have several of, it's great. Yeah. It's really good. Trying to think what else I kept around. Up in the Old Hotel, Joseph Mitchell. And, you know, they were really useful. Sometimes just, you know, you get stuck in your own voice and you read somebody else solving a problem, and then you suddenly figure out how to solve your problem, but it's in your own voice. Honestly, I think you couldn't do better than to go back through the 80 years of New Yorker history and read a lot of what was there for the models of how to do nonfiction. I was reading a lot of Liebling also at that time, and Lillian Ross, I love her stuff. And
we started this class with Lillian.
Oh, really?
Yeah, with picture and with...
oh, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I think she's fantastic. Mm-hmm. So those are the ones that I looked at. LaRoche, you asked how he reacted to the film.
Did he contact you?
Well, we were actually at a screening together. And, I mean, I had spoken to him when the book first came out, and I was kind of holding my breath thinking, oh, my God. And he said to me, well, you know, if you write a few more books, you might turn into a pretty good writer, which I thought was hilarious. But the first time he saw the movie was right before the Golden Globes, I think. And he came out of the screening kind of in shock. More than I mean, and I had, at that point I'd seen it several times, but also the physical similarity between John LaRoche and Chris Cooper was so powerful, and the mannerisms, and it was so intensely accurate that I think it kind of blew his mind. I mean, I had my mind blown, but it was not because, I mean, Meryl Streep wasn't trying to look like me or be me. I mean, it was weird enough, but it was, I think he was freaked out. Not like in a bad way. I think he was just in shock, kind of. And I think the whole thing was pretty crazy-making for him. I mean, just, I can't imagine. I can't imagine being the subject of a book. You know, I mean, I wrote it, but I wasn't I mean, I sort of was, but not the way he was.
Over it.
Yeah, and he was, and I think the film was quite, not to say he didn't like it, I just think, I remember him coming out and just being, you know, saying, wow, I mean, just being in a little bit of a shock.
Did the filmmakers have to buy his life rights?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because it was, I mean, they had to buy the life rights of everybody, everyone in the film, with the exception of Charlie Kaufman. Well, no, Charlie actually I mean, he wrote it, so he didn't have to buy his own life rights. But everybody in the film was real. I mean, all the film executives were the ones that we really dealt with. You know, everyone portrayed was real. So they had a very weird time getting life rights. And I initially had said no, and I just said, you know, go ahead and make the movie, but you have to change my name. This is crazy. I mean, this is going to ruin my career. And then I don't know why. One day I just said, oh yeah, all right, go ahead. And then a few friends of mine who were screenwriters said, you're insane. How could you do this? And I said, oh, well, it's too late now. I've done it. And then right before, as I walked into the first screening, I thought, it really is too late. I mean, I can't now say to them, could you mind not releasing the movie? So I said to them, could you just not play it in Cleveland so my parents never see it? I mean, but it was just, you know, one of those things where I knew they were trying to make a good movie, and the more I heard about who was involved, the more I felt that I could take the risk. But I still am a little amazed that I did it, because the thing that bothered me was being portrayed as having a sexual relationship with the subject. I didn't care about the drugs or the murders. I really didn't. And I had to sign a legal document saying I indemnify you from legal action on my part because you show me killing a fish and wildlife officer and using drugs. And I thought, as I was signing it, I thought, I have such a weird life. I can't believe it. But, you know, I was nervous about that, and I thought that part of the movie is just on the border of seeming credible. The other stuff was so absurd that I thought people would get that the film has sort of gone crazy. But the idea that I had a romantic relationship with him was just credible enough. And, you know, I'm sure there were plenty of reporters who end up getting involved with subjects. It's not unimaginable, but it was definitely unimaginable in my case. And there are still people who say to me, you know, with this very wistful, like, are you still in touch with John? And I say, no, you know, because I know what they're saying. But...
Okay, thank you, Susan, so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.